Okay, good. Thank you. Thank God. Great. So I'd like to bring up Dan Fleming, who is from New York University, and he's going to talk to us today about Emar, Carchemish, and the Hittites, the exercise of power without administration. Over to you, Dan.
So I appreciate the invitation. If I was a moment late, it's because I was talking to people that I haven't really had a chance to talk to about things of interest, of common interest, and that's the fruit of the event. The city of Emar, on the great bend of the Euphrates River, has been my scholarly home. Will this get us there? I began work on its ritual texts for my dissertation, and though I set it aside for years so as not to be trapped there, I returned for a long collaboration with Sophie Desmar-Lafont, this time with focus on the legal documentation. Now, Sophie has left it to me to complete a historical study, to be my focus during a coming year of leave. Since its discovery, Emar has seemed to be someone's periphery. Its cuneiform finds date to the late Bronze Age too, between the 14th and early 12th centuries, the era of the great kingdoms measured by the Amarna correspondence with Egypt, Babylon, Hatti, and Mitanni, giving way to Assyria. Until the 1970s, inland Syria had not received much archaeological attention, and the space between Mari on the Iraq border and Ugarit on the Mediterranean coast was almost a blank, what one scholar called a crossroads. The map has been filled in considerably since then, still leaving Emar at the edges of someone else's power, between Ebla and Mari in the 3rd millennium, between Aleppo and Mari in the early 2nd. Mitanni reached across Syria in the mid-2nd millennium, though its direct involvement with Emar is not clear. In the mid-14th century, Suppiluliuma I set up his son Piyassili to rule northern Syria from Carchemish, north of Emar on the Euphrates. And from the moment it was swept into this realm, Emar represented the southeast extremity of Hittite rule, thus the margins invitation, or at least I don't know why, but I appreciate it nonetheless. My own interest in Emar resists definition by frontiers and borderlands, here rendered as margins, and my historical study is focused less on relations with external powers than on the character of the city itself, which was never shaped essentially by outsiders. I will therefore be an interloper among the borderlanders of this event, hovering with interest at the edges of your framing concerns. I accepted the invitation with pleasure, knowing the occasion would get me thinking about my work for next year, browsing for perspectives on my peripheral hometown. After consideration of margins and general thoughts on Emar in this context, I will turn to Emar's relations with Carchemish, as visible in the textual evidence. In the description of this event, the organizers cite new alternatives to the conceptual framing of centers and peripheries, inviting us to consider the margins, frontiers, and borderlands. As a longtime resident of one such space, it strikes me with the thin-skinned sensitivity appropriate to my situation that all of these terminologies still define a place by what is outside it, by how it relates to something else, intrinsically larger, that maps a land with lines that we conceive as boundaries. These are not conceptions bound to modern nation states and their map-making requirements, but such borders adhere to the vocabulary nonetheless. Reading recently of modern buffer states, it occurred to me that this is a way of talking about what is on either side, even if as borderlands, such between states could be their own focus of study. The investigation of margins is inherently regional, concerned with a political landscape consisting of multiple elements, whatever the geometrical possibilities. This is not a flaw, it is a choice, and my idea is to be aware of its framing and implications. And if my object of study is at someone else's margin, How do I want this situation to influence my approach to it? Given the definition of this event and current interest in borders, consideration of margins certainly does not render the objects marginal, of secondary importance, or perhaps of importance only in the company of what bounds them. With the city of Emar in view, is it possible that examination in terms of borders is complemented by attention to the site as a center unto itself? Seen this way, Emar would still be embedded in a political landscape among neighbors of greater and lesser heft, both dominated and dominating, or at least capable of both in changing times. With the question of margins at hand, and the written evidence from late Bronze Age Emar my interest, the application of this analysis pertains to the large political stage, the jostling of great kingdoms across Syria and beyond. My questions about definitions would be different when the issue is simple interaction, as in Seth Sanders' Margins of Writing, addressing settings with the use of two languages or two scripts. Here the margins are defined by the coexistence of communication forms that ordinarily operate individually. Such appearance of more than one language and script in a single place may accompany power and connection across space, the activity of integration. One more manifestation of margins may be settings where identity and affiliation are fluid, negotiable, or simply obscure to the observer, with the real possibilities hidden behind patterns of naming in our sources. In this case, the interest of borders lies in their absence. We may perceive clear identities on either side of some space, geographical or social, but lines of real boundary are elusive and perhaps illusory. I think of Mari Leonard Fleckman's investigation of the southern Levantine foothills, where Judah and Philistia are difficult to map as fully distinct, and we are in danger of misunderstanding the identity landscape of the space between their settled centers. Emar's relationship to borders is more straightforward, whatever the implications of the framing choice. The identity of the city itself is not in question, but rather its relationship to the larger polities around it. Before turning to the city's relationship to the great kingdom of Hatti and its Carchemish center in northern Syria, it will be useful to consider Emar on its own terms. The site of Meskene, on the south side of the Euphrates River, as it makes its broad turn eastward toward Baghdad and Babylon, was first excavated between 1972 and 1976, when the Syrian government was building the dam that would create the Lake El Assad. It was expected that the waters would cover the site, but they only rose above the lower part of the tell, which rises east to west with the line of a ridge away from the river. So, site plan. Notice that the more white part is the section that was excavated. It's the higher part of the tell and the part where older occupation is known. Jean-Claude Margueron, the first excavator, concluded that the late Bronze Age city had been moved away from an original location in the floodplain, but joint German-Syrian excavations in the late 1990s demonstrated continuity going back to the early Bronze, though very little was uncovered for the earlier periods. Meskene was home to a late Roman and early Islamic town, situated mainly on the lower part of the site that was mostly inundated. But before that, it appears to have been unoccupied since the end of the Bronze Age in the 1180s. By far the richest finds for the early city come from this period, though the palace was never discovered, perhaps because the 1970s work focused on the western heights, and the palace may have overlooked the river on the east, like the arrangement at Ugarit facing west. After filling of the lake, it was too late to reconsider. Across the upper and middle parts of the city ridge, excavation revealed 3 temples and diverse residential areas, giving a sense of Emar's urbanism, which shows no domination by huge houses. The main sign of central planning, if it can be called that, is the eastern entrance provided for all 3 temples. It's a if you look all the way to, I can't tell what it'll be for you, the left side, there's a pair of temples, and then in the center, there's a third one. Sorry. Yes, so if it can be called, the main sign of central planning, if it can be called that, is the eastern entrance provided for all three temples, each with a small open space in front, two in parallel at the western height and another near city center. Written finds can distract from the excavated whole by the very importance of their contents, and my focus here will nevertheless be just that textual evidence, which offers the most complete view of Emar as a community and as situated in the larger world. Batches of tablets were found in all three of the temples and several of the houses, but by far the largest collection turned up in the workplace of a man who bridged local religious life and outside Hittite rule, identified by an old local title as the diviner of the gods. With the appointment of Zubatla to this post, sometime in the early 13th century, this diviner represents the closest thing we know securely to be a resident Hittite official, and his function was defined entirely by his service at Emar in a job that preceded Hittite arrival. Most of the surviving documentation from late Bronze Age Emar followed Hittite conquest, but at least two ritual tablets and a small body of legal texts predate this event and allow us to see and evaluate continuity with the immediately preceding period. Stepping back from the excavated late Bronze Age city and its texts, Emar makes occasional appearance in writing from earlier periods, including the Idrimi statue text from Alalach, perhaps from the 15th century, the 18th century letters from Mari, and 3rd millennium writing from Ebla. Emar never dominated its larger region, even as it appears to have consistently marked the point of reference for the bend of the Euphrates. Tutul downstream and Carchemish upstream were never disturbed by Emar ambitions. Equally, through the Bronze Age, Emar seems to have shifted in and out of the shadow of larger neighbors without changing its essential shape. The Mari letters show extensive contact with Emar, which was just outside the Mari domain, somehow accountable to the large kingdom of Yamkhad based at Aleppo. During this period, if there was a king at Emar, Mari travelers had no need to deal with him. Instead, we hear of a collective council called the Tahtamum, an institution found also at Tutul. Both Middle Euphrates cities had long-standing urban traditions that gave priority to the body politic, a Western Asian counterpart to the later Greek polis. By the time of the earliest late Bronze Age legal documents from Emar, the city had a stable local monarchy, not set against the collective political tradition, but fully integrated with it. The oldest texts involve the sale of real estate held by the city to private parties, raising funds for unknown purpose. These texts are all witnessed by a small circle of men who can be traced to the company of someone occasionally identified as Lugal or king, though not generally named as such to go with his first place among witnesses. The land sales take a form standard to the larger type, except that the sellers are a god written as the Sumerian Ninurta and the elders of Emar, or in the oldest text simply the city of Emar. A prohibitively high payment is required for any future claim on the land to be paid to Ninurta and the city. These early texts from before Hittite conquest are dated by a system of eponyms, a practice of cycling city leadership, like the annual eponyms of Old Ashur, except that the office is held for 2 years, without evident connection to the king. The authority of the collective city is associated with the seal of Ninurta, which is rolled onto these tablets along with that of the king. When the Hittites arrived, this is what they found at Emar, and they left it in place. As long as there were local kings at Emar, which Sophie and I understand to have continued through most of the 13th century, The entire political and economic system reflected in these land sales was maintained with only minor changes. Following our friends Lorenzo d'Alfonso and Joram Cohen, we conclude that the Emar monarchy collapsed before the city itself, though the precise date is a matter of discussion. I had assumed that the critical political transformation represented by the end of local kings, since it occurred during Hittite sovereignty, must have come at the initiative of the overlords. On closer examination, however, I realized that there is no indication of this, and that a better explanation is internal disarray and disintegration, which then the great power had to accommodate as best they could, a situation perhaps familiar to modern American foreign affairs. With the demise of local monarchy, all sign of the collective land custom disappears as well. Perhaps a generation later, after Emar fell or was abandoned in the face of unknown threats, the city was abandoned permanently, part of a larger pattern in the long section of the Euphrates Valley between a point south of Carchemish and the region of Terka, where the Chabur River joins the Euphrates. This population collapse cannot be explained by the particular relationship of Emar with the Hittite kingdom or its Carchemish subsidiary, nor is it attributable to Assyrian activity to the east. This is simply an up-to-date chart with the evidence for various late Bronze Age settlements in the region from the previous map. And notice at least that Emar and a place called El Kitar are the last ones standing. Sorry, I found my place. Emar and Tutul indeed stood between the Hittite and the Assyrian great kingdoms, a space that could be called a geographical borderland. But much that made it thrive and eventually perish reflected circumstances not clearly defined by the margins of neighboring powers. It may even be that integration into the Hittite and Carchemish kingdoms helped Emar persist as long as it did. In the 12th century, Carchemish survived the demise of its Hittite parent, but its more limited interests no longer needed or concerned the Euphrates downriver. While the Hittites claim to have brought northern Syria into their sphere during the mid-14th century when Suppiluliuma I swept through the region, direct evidence for foreign presence at Emar first appears among the local texts during the reign of the Carchemish king Shahurunua, who reigned roughly 1300 to 1270. Only during the reign of his son Initeshub, roughly 1270 to 1230, do we see more frequent involvement at Emar of Carchemish kings and their circles. It is more difficult to track outside influence during the last decades of late Bronze Emar, even as the local monarchy was coming apart, evidently replaced by a leader bearing the Hittite administrative title Ugula Kalamma, overseer of the land. The concrete activity of external power from Carchemish and Hattusa is elusive, something I have not adequately pursued. The first feature of Emar at the margins of Hittite dominion, therefore, may be the chronological limits of this situation. Hittite control of northern Syria could be generalized to cover more than 150 years from the mid-14th century to the 1180s, but traceable interaction involves something more like 50 years. This does not mean that the Hittites were absent outside that period, but it raises the possibility that the hand of external power rested even more lightly on the shoulder of this Assyrian city. Because the written evidence is most extensive for the middle of the 13th century, I will focus with the rest of my time on what appears to be the time of most intense exchange. Viewed from within the Emar assemblage of cuneiform texts, two important innovations correspond closely with the intensification of outside involvement in the early 13th century, neither of which would appear on first inspection to reflect foreign impositions. One private document from the Diviner's Archive renews the Hittite commitment to Zubala made through Carchemish, with Initeshub apparently a recent arrival to the Carchemish throne. As part of that arrangement, Zubala took over the substantial property of his predecessor in the diviner's office. We know little of that predecessor, but it appears that the change of family assignment to Zubala may best be understood as a Hittite appointment, or at least approval, making the responsibility for supervising public ritual at Emar a Hittite concession. The Semitic name Zubatla points away from an Anatolian origin for this important new figure, but a second innovation suggests that he was not part of the old Emar community. All the earliest legal documents from Emar are composed in a form reaching back to Old Babylonian scribal practice. Starting with the time of Zubatla the diviner and Shahurunua the king at Carchemish, a completely new type of writing appears at Emar, shared broadly with writing from Carchemish and of more up-to-date style, cuneiform chic. This new writing, which Sophie and I identify as free format for its malleable service to legal documentation, in contrast to the stodgy, conventional format of old practice, was not imposed from outside. It appears rather to have served the writing needs of the many people flowing through Emar who did not belong to the community as such, who were not what we call townsmen, participants in the collective land sale custom with its elders of Emar and its eponyms. A wide variety of people who were clearly resident at Emar recorded their legal affairs with the aid of this alternative scribal practice. And all the family documents of Zubatla and Sons do the same. Likewise, the diviner's ritual and administrative documentation, their letters, and the signed copies of educational texts all display the same free format script. While the new diviner's family and the proliferation of free format writing reflect the tug of Hittite and Carchemish influence on Emar affairs, there is no question that Emar was firmly attached to the great kingdom through the Carchemish capital, the exercise of external power. Excuse me, I think I missed an and. There is no question that Emar was firmly attached. The exercise of external power seems to have followed relationships between leaders without the imposition of institutional structures that might be called administration. Except for the diviner's scribal center with its trove of tablets, there is no clear evidence for the full-time residence of Hittite or Carchemish officials in the city. Along with the king of Carchemish, whose authority and presence are displayed in a handful of legal documents relating to Emar, we find high officials called Dumulugal, son of the king, and Ugula Kalama, overseer of the land. But we do not see their ongoing presence. They do not own real estate at Emar, and there is no reference to buildings at Emar identified with their regular residence or administrative activity. The only collection of texts found at Emar that can be treated as administrative comes from the diviner's workplace, and these do not show engagement with any on-site Carchemish office. When the diviners had business with the outside powers, we find it conducted in letters. The appearance of outside officials in legal documents for Emar residents indicate visits to the city, however long and with whatever larger purpose. A small number of documents with the royal seal of Carchemish and in the presence of Ini Teshub especially could be explained either by travel to the central court or by the ruler's appearance at Emar. As a whole, the pattern of witness in the legal documents involving external authority is as variable as in the free format generally, so that these texts suggest ad hoc composition rather than the operation of a fixed and repeating system. With this tour of late Bronze Age Emar, I have moved quickly from one attraction to the next, without lingering on individual texts. To conclude, I turn to a letter that drew the attention of Sophie when we were struggling to understand how the old legal custom of the conventional format documents could coexist for some period with the new free format during this period of occasional Carchemish entanglement in local affairs. TSBR 95, that's your handout, was one of many tablets looted from Meskene and published in batches as they were made available by various private purchasers. Daniel Arnaud originally identified the sender as the king, read from the perfectly damaged part of the opening line, an old tradition, which allowed Lorenzo to propose son of the king instead of the simple lugal, which space makes more likely, that is, the shorter reading. In any case, either the king of Carchemish, perhaps Initeshub, or a very high representative, writes to Mahdi Dagan, a known Emar scribe with strong Carchemish connections. The case concerns a woman from the old Emar community who has lost her house to another man, evidently an outsider since Carchemish is now involved. In order to prove her right to the property, she produces the tablet of her house sealed by the seal of Ninurta, exactly what is attested by dozens of legal documents recording the purchase of real estate from the city under old conventional format practice, only available to Emar townspeople. The king, or his representative, decides in favor of the woman based on the documented claim from local Emar law, a practical demonstration of the respect evidently paid by the outside power to long-standing Emar social and legal custom. It is interesting that this judgment is made in absentia, delivered to a local scribe who can serve as intermediary and make sure that the decision is executed. No Carchemish authority appears to be available to settle the matter without such correspondence at distance. The external power is real and its exercise concrete, even as it is carried out in this case at distance and with concern to maintain the stability of long-standing local norms. With the preceding sketch of Emar and its Hittite experience in view, what difference does it make to take into account the city's location at the margins of the Hittite domain? It does not appear that Emar in this period made any visible attempt to rebel. Others here know the larger Hittite context far better than I, but the great kingdom's preference to keep and cultivate the structures of conquered polities need not be understood to apply only at greatest distance from the center. At least under Initeshub, we might imagine a particular investment in Emar that may follow its border situation. In his new work on the Zukru, the great ritual celebration of Emar as community, T.J. Thames proposes that the festival version of this event, set in a certain seventh year and costing more than the rest of Emar ritual combined, was funded by Carchemish, perhaps even by Initeshub. During the mid-13th century, the expansion of Assyria from the east was a looming threat, pushing up against the opposite bank of the Euphrates at certain points upstream, not far from Carchemish itself. It may be that Emar's very independence, the weight of its own old traditions, offered a resource to Hittite and Carchemish power that took a particular form at its geographical extremity. Instead of weakness and conflict at the edges of what might seem contested space, Emar securely served the border against Assyrian power, until it all came apart. Here also I am wary of defining Emar by the major powers surrounding it. The city, and indeed the whole river valley, suffered a near-permanent reversal, not because of Hatti, Carchemish, and Assyria, but from causes unknown, somehow relating to large changes in patterns of movement across western Mesopotamia and Syria, leaving the Middle Euphrates, a dried-up meander, with the main flow now running east and west across the foothills to the north. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gojko. That was really interesting, and as someone who loves Kanesh, I found that particularly fascinating. So I'd like to invite Dan up as well, and we can have some questions and discussions based on the two papers. So, please.
Do I get to ask?
Do you want to ask one first? Go ahead.
I don't have to go first. Just saying.
Please do.
So I was thinking when Gojko had a slide with kind of local identity terms and then a longer set of modern ones in effect, or at least scholarly ones. And what struck me is, I don't have my notes right, but he had something called Nuwa'um, and then Amurum, Shubarum, and Akadum. And it reminded me of a text from Mari that's talking about scribes and language. You must know, I'm sure you know this, right? Which lists, so there's 4 different languages that Mari period scribes would identify themselves in their own terms, and they are Akkadian, Sumerian, and then Amurum, like apparently West Semitic, Shubarum, not knowing for sure if it's Hurrian or something like that. So immediately I see that list of 3, and I wonder, well, what's Nuaum, and what is the relationship between these names and language? And then, of course, wonderfully, you provide actual personal names which show that, as everywhere, right, that names don't align with language. But I was wondering what more you would say about, especially Nuaum, and this question of language and identity.
Thank you for that question. That's a really tough nut to crack. I mean, people have struggled with that term Nuaum for a long time. Some have suggested that it's to be understood actually as a sort of an onomatopoeia, and the people who speak Nua in parallel to, you know, the Greek people who speak bar, right? So those who talk funny. Niemets in Russian about the Germans and so on. Others have suggested it could be linked to Luwian, that Nuaum is Luaum, that it's the same thing, and that it's sort of a common hat term for the Anatolian languages. But again, this was proposed by modern linguists, and I think there's a connection there. As far as I can see, as it's used in the text, it's always just anybody who lives in Anatolia, and the only group that is distinct, and it's very rarely so made distinct, is the Suberian one. There is a guy who is called the Suberian, and who seems to have had a cart in Kanesh, and you could hire him to get firewood and things like that. And he's referred to as the Suberian. But that's really it. Otherwise, all those terms, the Suberian, the Amorite, and the Akkadian, only turn up in treaties and letters and things like that, where they will talk about foreigners and how to protect their trade. There it becomes important. Does that answer the question?
Yes, but I could go further, but there are other people who have questions.
More questions?
Perfect. I will start with code. And I would like to ask your opinion on this list, if you can get that. I am a little bit skeptical because for a society that does not have a writing system and starts describing functions, the fact that in most cases Sumerian is chosen and traditional forms of it deriving mainly from the northern periphery reception of administrative terms from Sipar and blah blah. The fact that there is a correspondence in meaning to things that we find normally in syllabic writing in Kanesh, the fact that we do not have the adoption of that syllabic writing, but a completely different one, let me think whether the genetic relation is not in an earlier period and in a shared conception of administration that is northern Mesopotamian, rather than in the movement of one community from Kanesh to Hattusa and so on. I wanted to hear what was your opinion, and maybe also Dan's opinion on this.
I can't pretend that I didn't think about it. It is a problem. My thoughts on the matter at the moment, I cannot evaluate the validity of Bilgi's list. I'm not a Hittitologist, but it seems to be pretty comprehensive. And as far as I can see, the fact that the titles are written out in syllabic Akkadian at Kanesh, and the seemingly same title is written then logographically at Hattush doesn't really bother me. I think we shouldn't think of these as Sumerian. We should think of them as word signs. To these people, these are just symbols of something, right? So if you have someone who is, let's say, a prefect of the land, this can be written either logographically or it can be written syllabically, and the two systems are perhaps mainly diverging on the more sort of you could say the sophistication of the scribal class at Hattush would have operated with these kinds of terms, whereas a merchant in Kanesh would not. He would typically just write it out in his own language as logograms. But that may be the chicken's way out.
One question and suggestion for you. You mentioned that, you mentioned that you didn't find any judges in the record. I just thought that, you made some connections between the later Hittite system of officials, but in the Hittite period, you have, for instance, judges in a provincial setting would be, legal cases in a provincial setting would be judged by the border governor, the mashkim of the city governor, and the elders. So all three were involved, and when they couldn't resolve it, then it would go to. So there too, we don't have that position. It was various bodies working together, officials and local communities. So I think that might be of interest. The other is something, to go back to, I'm sorry, the difficult question of Nuawu. I have one question. There's this, based on Hittite lexical texts from the later period, which equate Nuawu with the Hittite word dampupi, which is very hard to say with a straight face, and the Sumerian Lu Gabtar or Lu Ashkab. It was suggested earlier on that it meant like dumb or barbaric or something, but Klinger suggested that it could mean something like lay people with. So I wondered whether Nu'a'um is just a term in the old Assyrian documents for the entire population, or is it just, could it be like a social category among the locals? Do we have any indications? Could it be just not the entire Anatolians, but the late, I can't think of anything that is lay people.
The non-elite, is that what you mean?
Non-elites or certain agricultural workers or some segment of the society rather than the entire Anatolians.
It doesn't seem to distinguish in any way neither sort of social nor what we would term linguistic or otherwise. No, it doesn't look like. And there are quite a number of examples, right? I think it's probably 100 or so texts that carry the term. It is just, and it's neutral. It's never sort of derisive or anything like that. It just is local. Then that's how, therefore, we usually now choose to translate it, simply as neutral as possible, as a local person, a native.
Yeah, I was struck by both of your papers, and this is less a question than a comment that you may or may not want to react to, but I'm struck by, in both papers, the ways in which regardless of however we want to characterize these settlements as marginal frontier or borderland, but how their relationships to what I think is without dispute a bigger entity that is exerting pressure on it are quite different, and that is, and paired with that, we have how we're trying to see these social and economic and political forms in this local setting through the lens of texts introduced in script in very different ways. And that struck me in both presentations. This came up of the projection from the center in and its pressures, in the instance of Kanesh being driven by actual people moving back and forth, and then their relationships and interaction, but actually sending people and the text produced going both ways with a more, even if it's a non-native bias, we have the people that are moving the text, versus at Emar we have this very different picture where we have these nebulous introductions of script, and I think your nuance to that is a very good move in terms of Emar studies, but and we don't see the people, we don't see the people projecting in. We have traces of the Hittite king and the ruler in Carchemish asserting himself in Emar, but it's much harder to see the place of the local people interacting with these two periods of the script. So that struck me as a really interesting juxtaposition in terms of the two corpora and the problems they present within the themes of the conference as a whole.
In a way, I'll just thank you for the comment, and again, that kind of general thanks to the organizers, but in the sense that by putting the margins at the center of the conversation, part of what it invites us to do is to complicate that, right? And that's part of what you're responding to also, you know, that once you start looking more closely at it, individual sites, individual types of problems even, then, and you think about those in relation to borders, in relation to distance from centers, whatever those are, you start asking yourself, like, what's the best framework? And what happens when I adjust the framework? And yeah, I think both Gojko and I were stimulated by the question and then pulling on it in a different direction.
I would say the same went for a number of the other papers. One that struck me was yours yesterday, the first paper we heard. And what is also striking, if you look at that case, which is Israel in the Iron Age, and yours, and the one I just presented, how the opportunity to compare the cases in a forum like this accentuates the very obvious fact that we're incredibly driven by sort of the representativity of our sources or the lack of it, and how we are forced to deal with that in very different ways as we're pulling on these different strings. So that has been a striking feature, I think, of the meeting.
One more question, and then I think we'll all lunch. This is a comment on Dennis, paper that I like a lot. And the comment is all in the text that you showed us, because the idea of rule with, if not without, with officials around and not an administration, is something that I fully agree with. And you showed also in the term of presence analysis. What is there and holds things together, in my opinion, is procedure. So not law and administration. And you see in the first part of the letter, you have stuff that is not discussed among officials that are Hittites. There is a woman that is the head of a family. This is Emar, typically Emar, but she's not presented through the fictitious explanation of being a maid of a female and so on. She is a woman. Once. The second, the seal of Nimur. This is not a Hittite thing at all. And so here we have this and the other mention of the Hittite for the use of this logo. They date both prosopographically at the very beginning of the reign of Interconnections, so that can be something that was relevant. But from the legal point of view, once again, it is not Hittite law, and this goes back to Ilki reference of the instructions for the mortality. And the final part that you have described there, so when a case becomes too big, so normally there should be elders, when it becomes too big, then the case must move, and the parties have to go to the king. This is a procedure established in the late 15th century, beginning of 14th century, for possibly central Anatolia, but then you find back in the margin there. So I just wanted to know what is your opinion about this no administration, but procedures, administrative procedures. Will you buy that?
No, I like the idea, obviously. So Lorenzo and I have spoken, even also with Sophie, about Carchemish and about the larger structures. And at some level, we all were saying in different ways that so much the relationship between, well, especially Carchemish and Emar seems to be built around relationships, that there are specific people and the relationships that they have across that distance. And it's a new idea, what you just said, which I like. I mean, to think that it could perhaps be a combination then of the relationships, but what gives those relationships structure would be procedure, as you're thinking. I'd have to work it out, like what then, how to think about it. But obviously one would be law. This question about judges, by the way, I'm trying to remember in what teaching context this came up, but thinking about judging in general, like this is I guess one of my students was writing and talking about judges as if they were this universal category in Mesopotamia, just in Akkadian, Sumerian. But it's a very particular, almost bureaucratic sort of notion that you would have institutionalized judges. It's only applicable to big kingdoms, really, that you would institutionalize that in that kind of way. And what you were observing is that, yes, there's judging, but it's not done by somebody that's institutionally defined as judges. And so, but again, thinking about procedure, including what you do in the case of a contested, legal arrangement, even without judges. I like the idea. And then the question is, what other categories would apply? I mean, the whole thing, looking at Matt, about the diviner and what this guy is doing, because there's also a whole ritual responsibility, but that somehow has an external interest, right? There are glimpses of a financial interest from outside. And that might be a second category that has a procedural dimension. Lunch, anyone?
You can smell it.
Isn't that interesting that Emar is the only other place, and yet it's not using the Lingam term?